Are you ready for the shocking truth about how exhausted Crusaders turned an ambush to their advantage? The story of that morning in Asia Minor shatters conventional notions of medieval warfare and shows how discipline and faith can withstand the onslaught of mobile cavalry. The knights weren't looking for a cool duel, but were holding their camp, where everything was decided by minutes and cold calculation. Their enemy put speed, firepower, and steppe warfare experience into the maneuver, but underestimated the ability of foot and horse formations to hold their ground under pressure. On the dusty bank of a shallow river, the road to Antioch and Jerusalem was decided, and with it, the fate of the Sultanate of Rum itself. Watch the video to the end to find out how the Crusader camp, which had been divided during the march, held out and then closed ranks in a strike that shattered the Sultan's ambitions. What you are about to see turns the usual picture of the campaign upside down. The attackers considered themselves hunters, confident in their right to hunt under the sun, but soon realized that they themselves had fallen into a trap of time, space, and fatigue. The plain which they considered their field turned out to be a trap where movement decided everything. The first column of Crusaders advanced under the command of Bohemond of Taranto and Robert of Normandy, keeping formation between the dry riverbeds and low hills. They moved cautiously, but did not suspect that they had been watched since dawn. The train included craftsmen, pilgrims, infantry, pack animals, and carts with supplies, a whole living city on the move. Horse guards covered the perimeter, unsure whether the Allied troops would be able to close ranks in time. The knights' faces showed a mixture of determination and anxiety. The sun was rising too quickly, the air was shimmering with heat, and ahead lay the ruins of an ancient city, a dead witness to past wars. Sultan Kilij Arslan gathered around him the allied troops of the Anatolian emirs and mounted archers, experienced in swift battles. He knew how this mass of pilgrims operated, knew their slowness and their belief in direct combat. His plan was precise, not to break through head-on, but to wear down the enemy, make them breathe dust, break their formation, not with swords, but with fatigue. He chose the place and time almost flawlessly, to strike at midday, when the sun burns the moisture out of the air, when the straps of armor stick to the skin, and every breath cuts the throat. Dust settled on shoulders, helmets, and chainmail, making even simple movements difficult. At such a moment, a man ceased to be a warrior and became part of the earth he could not defeat. The opening volley of arrows tore through the air suddenly. A dense wave whistled from both sides, turning the plain into a gray, smoking carpet. A quick flanking maneuver forced Bowman and Robert's advance guard to retreat to the supply train, linking the carts into a ring and turning the camp into a kind of field fort. Where prayers had been said that morning, defenses were now being built. The inner circle was held by spearmen and crossbowmen, shield bearers lined up in rows in the shade, and knights were seated on their horses so as not to waste their strength on useless throws. Everything was changing every minute. The wind was blowing dust, visibility was falling, and every command had to be clear, otherwise order would be lost. There was no place for knightly heroism here. This was the craft of survival. The distance between the troops took on a life of its own. The enemy cavalry circled like birds of prey, sending arrows at angles where shields could not protect. The response was short sorties of 3 or 4 warriors, counterattacks in small groups, just to break the enemy's rhythm. These movements resembled the breathing of a living organism. The camp contracted and expanded, experiencing each onslaught as if it were a heart beating beneath steel skin. Behind this breathing came the second column. Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond of Toulouse, Admar of Le Puy, and Tancred. Their troops hurried along the trail, catching up with the first wave, sensing where the battle was raging by the sound of arrows. There were only a few miles between the two forces, and every minute cost lives. The enemy cavalry again tried to disrupt the formation, firing arrows to cause panic, but they were met with a solid wall of shields and the patience of men who had learned to fight not for glory, but for tomorrow. The spearmen held their line, the crossbowmen changed positions on signal, and the knights dismounted, helped the common soldiers, a rare sight in Europe at that time. It was a day when discipline proved stronger than force. I am very interested to hear your point of view. Do you agree that the true power of the Crusaders on that day lay not in the charge of heavy cavalry, not in the fierce thrust of spears, but in training, patient defense, and conservation of strength? In the fact that they managed to turn their camp into a living shield? Write about it in the comments and subscribe to the channel. Ahead is an analysis of how exactly the second column changed the outcome of the battle and why defense turned out to be the first real lesson of war in the East.
Shields up! Steady now! Steady! Brace for impact!
Are you ready to learn the truth about how minutes and routes determine the outcome of the perfect nomadic ambush? The Sultan sought to stretch the enemy's formation, force the front corps to retreat from flank cover, and turn the camp into an easy target. He used what always worked against heavy troops: pressure on their nerves, constant shelling, and false retreats to draw the knights into a futile chase. But Bohemond stuck to the opposite logic, forbidding his men to break off in pursuit and keeping them in a circle where every cart, saddle, and barrel became an element of defense. The tactic seemed passive, but it bought the most precious thing in the world: time for the Allies, who were already raising dust on the horizon, to approach. When provocations failed to break the camp's formation, the enemy cavalry began to ram into wedges, trying to break through the living wall. Each attempt was met with spears, axes, and short bursts of knights into the gaps between the carts. Water was running out, the heat was pressing down, and everything depended on the endurance of the ordinary infantrymen covering the knights' banners. It was at this moment that the value of the slow but persistent march of the second column became clear even to those who had doubted it in the morning. How often in history do you think victory in an ambush is brought about not by the sharpness of a maneuver, but by control over time? And are you ready to move on to the next chapter, where we will discuss how to create an invisible shield for a stationary camp? I will reveal the most closely guarded secret of an improvised fortress, which is rarely found in textbooks. The cross camp was not a random pile of carts. It was a system designed on the fly. The carts were placed side by side, the ground under the wheels was compacted, and they were tied together in a closed oval, almost perfect in plan. Yokes, chains, leather straps, and even stretched belt straps were used. Anything that could close the gap and stop the cavalry on the approach. Boards were placed between the carts, ropes were wrapped around them, and slits were made only for archers. Narrow gates were left intentionally, for short sorties where every second counted. Each cart became a wall, each wheel a shield. Thus, from a convoy intended for travel, a fort was born, standing across the path of destiny. The shield bearers formed the inner line of defense. They knew their place and their pace, half the length of a spear from their neighbor, so as not to break the rhythm. The crossbowmen worked from the gaps between the carts, firing at targets that came closer than the steppe dwellers would have liked. Their bolts struck horses, hands, and faces, forcing the enemy to change direction. The movement of arrows and dust turned the field into a smoky semicircle where everything was decided by ear. The knights were seated so as not to waste the strength of their horses and not to waste their lives in vain. They were taken out one by one in short counterattacks to where the pressure was greatest and immediately brought back inside. This rhythm was precise, almost musical. Step, push, turn, retreat. Don't give the enemy time, but don't let yourself get exhausted. This rhythm turned the enemy's maneuver into a series of short, consumed waves that crashed against the immovable mass of carts. The steppe archers were accustomed to open terrain and freedom of flanking, but here they lacked space. They circled, looking for gaps, but their arrows increasingly found wood and iron rather than flesh. With each attempt to bypass the camp, the attack grew weaker, and the Crusaders' sorties became more accurate. Before the enemy's eyes, the camp was turning from a target into a motionless beast that waited and did not die. Discipline was the key. Do not chase. Do not throw down your shields. Do not waste arrows at a range where they lose their power. Anyone who broke the rules risked not only themselves but also the formation. Inside the circle, water was distributed. One sip, no more. Raincoats and sails were used to make shelters so that people would not lose consciousness from the heat. Soldiers with burned shoulders were bandaged right under the wall of the cart, where sacks of flour and shields from the supplies lay. Water was mixed with vinegar to reduce the heat and pass from hand to hand. Commanders kept their banners in visible places, even if the poles broke. Then a spearman would go to the spot, raise the cloth on his pole, and the camp would again see where its center was. This gesture was more important than orders. As long as the banner stood, the battle continued. In between attacks, the camp was reorganized. Heavy carts were pulled up, stakes were rearranged, and new windows were opened for sorties to deceive the enemy. Sometimes the direction of the carts was changed to close gaps, like a chess player blocking a diagonal. Everything happened quickly and without word. Routine saved lives. Inside there was the sound of breathing and the creaking of wood. People were silent, conserving their strength, listening to the rustle of arrows and the pounding of hooves outside the wall. No one knew how long the day would last. Everyone could see only a piece of sky between the carts, a square of light where the arrows flew, but that square kept them all together. If you consider such ugly tactics to be an example of mature field science, the science of patience, calculation, and memory of past defeats, give it a like and we'll continue. In the next part, I will show how one mistake with water almost cost them their entire advantage and why discipline in the heat proved to be more difficult than the battle itself. Guess what happened next when the mounted archers realized that their arrows were not breaking the formation? The enemy increased pressure on the flanks, sending groups around to the water and trying to cut off the approach routes of the second column. Part of the forces descended on the point where the ground allowed the horses to go faster, hoping to break the deadlock and turn the camp to flight. But any breach was met with a counterattack by dozens of heavily armed knights who would rush out in a wedge formation and immediately retreat back inside. Minutes passed in the dust of the camp, and on the far edge of the plain, the signs of Allied banners were already visible as they approached the shore of a shallow river. The decision to wage a frontal war of attrition prolonged the battle, but did not bring about a breakthrough, because it is impossible to push an enemy who does not want to chase you out of the circle with gunfire. The attempt to stretch the camp to the side of the road and pull the gate towards them was met with a reorganization of the carts and a new line of infantry. The noise of the battle was swallowed up by the ravines and the edge of the reeds by the water, where Ryman and Gottfried's spears first appeared. From that moment on, the defense gained depth, and the ambush plan gained an enemy in the rear. In the next chapter, you will learn how columns that have not seen each other since morning communicate with each other, but arrive exactly where they are expected. There will be no grandiose promises here, only an analysis of how a march is turned into an attack. This transition from movement to battle has always been the most dangerous part of a campaign, where fatigue and discipline decide the outcome faster than a sword. The second column had been following since morning, following the roads that had already been trampled by the hooves and wheels of the first. Dust stood like a wall. The sun shone from the side, not from above, and it seemed that time stretched out between steps. They did not know the exact hour of the clash ahead. They only heard a dull rumble and rare echoes of horns, like a distant echo of disaster. The commanders kept the formation tight, not allowing the troops to scatter along the side roads, where it was easy to lose direction and communication. The servants urged on the pack animals, the carts closed ranks, and the spearmen marched without raising dust, so as not to give away their pace. Everyone understood that the march could turn into battle at any moment. Scouts brought increasingly alarming news: hoof prints, burnt quivers, cart tracks, and extinguished campfires. The smell of smoke mixed with dust hung in the air, and commanders pulled the front hundreds closer to the center so as not to stretch the line. The horses snorted, sensing a change in the wind. There was a battle ahead. When the column reached the river, everything became clear. A curtain of dust swirled ahead, and banners fluttered above it. The camp was holding. Their task became simple and terrifying at the same time: to strike not at the fortified circle where their own stood, but at those who circled around like a pack confident of their prey. Deploying their wedges, the second column crossed the ford. The water boiled under their hooves from the pressure, the streams muddied, whipping up silt, and the sounds of armor mingled with the roar of the command. Bowmen of Taranto's advanced wedge already saw movement on the other bank. Heavy cavalry descending to the water, and cries of joy broke through even the roar of battle.
Deus vult! Huzzah! To victory!
The blow came just as the enemy thought they had the upper hand. From the flank, which had been empty before, a living wall of spears suddenly rose, glistening in the sun, and the steppe warriors' usual circle of attack was broken. The engagement was in 2 stages, but required perfect training. First, the light cavalry groups, the Franks and Normans, broke through the curtain of archers, clearing the way for the main attack. Their shields clanged under a hail of arrows, but they did not falter. Then the heavy spearmen closed ranks in a wide line, lining up side by side, closing the gaps. This front did not shine. It hummed like a blacksmith's bellows. Every spear found support, every knee held the ground. The camp came to life in response. The signs of the Allied banners were already visible from there, and according to the agreed signals, the gates were being prepared for a sortie. The infantry centuries of provincials and Normans moved to the edge of the circle to deploy in an offensive order. The sergeant's shouts drowned out the noise of battle. "Keep your ranks, don't break formation!" And at that moment, the entire defense turned into an attack. Water, dust, heat, and noise merged into a single rhythm. Sultan Kilij Arslan stood on a hill and saw his line of archers breaking, not from defeat, but from confusion. He had to decide whether to continue the assault on the circular defense, where his men were already losing strength, or to turn to new opponents, fresh, cold, with horses and a supply of arrows. The answer turned out to be not a decision, but a mistake, an attempt to do both things at once. One part of the cavalry remained at the camp, the other rushed to the river, and the field split in 2. The connection between the wings disappeared. Signals were lost in the dust, and the blows ceased to fall in unison. It was at this very moment that the turning point was born, which would later be called the late hour of the ambush. Not because someone had set a trap, but because the patience of the first column and the determination of the second converged at a single point, and chaos gave way to order. If you want to know what this turning point looked like through the eyes of those who found themselves inside the circle, when the camp first opened its gates and went out to meet its own, be sure to watch the next part. There we will examine how order was born out of chaos and why this particular day became the moment when the crusade first felt like an army rather than a mob.
Deus vult! Charge!
Ready to learn the secret that changes the way you look at the finale of any step maneuver? It was here in this short hour after noon that the fate of the battle was turned upside down. As soon as the second column struck across the ford, a signal was raised in the camp, a flag tied to a spear shaft, and the gates swung open. Knightly troops burst out from inside, not in chaos, but according to a plan rehearsed in the morning silence. 2 waves, one from the inside, the other from the outside, converged in a coordinated rush. The screech of stirrups, the clang of iron, and the weight of spears turned the plain into a ringing circle. The result was a pincer movement, where the inner defense became an outer strike, and the second line of allies closed off the space for retreat. From that moment on, the enemy lost not the front, but the air between the blows. In the narrow space between the river, the edge of the bushes, and the rows of carts, the main advantage of the steppe dwellers, speed, disappeared. Horseback shooting lost its momentum, and maneuvering lost its breath. Attempts to turn around turned into chaos. Arrows flew toward their own, horses bumped into carts, and the field where freedom reigned in the morning now shrunk to the size of a courtyard. Any attempt to break through was met with a double wall of spears and shields. The outer front struck from the side, the inner front pushed forward, and the pressure that had belonged to the steppe in the morning now worked against it. The Crusader commanders maintained order, not allowing success to turn into chaos. They knew the price of haste. A chase could break the formation and open the flank. Therefore, the horn signals sounded rarely and clearly. Each company knew its sector. Who held the left flank? Who covered the mouth of the ford? Who pushed the archers back to the hills? Their goal was not destruction, but displacement, freeing up space around the camp. The knights dismounted when their horses grew tired and finished off their enemies on foot with thrusts of their lances so as not to waste the animal's breath. Everything happened calmly, almost without shouting, as if the men were simply doing their long, familiar work. The steppe cavalry was losing its rhythm. The open space, its main ally, was disappearing with every step. The dust was no longer a cover, but a trap. The rotating battlefield was turning into a tight ring, and the blows were getting closer and closer. There was less and less room to maneuver, and even the art of shooting at full gallop did not help. Enemy groups began to disperse, retreating to the southeast, where there were still lowlands for retreat. There they gathered the wounded, rescued the banners and the remains of the horses. For the Crusaders, it was no longer a pursuit. It was a liberation of the field. When the dust settled, the camp closed its gates. The wagons began to be rearranged for the further march. Now in order, not in alarm, the infantry took care of the field. They collected arrows, bandaged the wounded, extinguished the remains of the fires, and checked the fastenings of the carts. Where there had been a roar in the morning, now only breathing could be heard. Steam rose above the river, and the sun reflected off the shields like mirrors. The end of this battle turned out to be not a triumph, but a lesson. An ambush plan requires an instant breakthrough. Otherwise, its noose tightens around the necks of those who conceived it. Any prolonged mill turns speed into shackles and space into a bottleneck. For a steppe warrior, the loss of movement is worse than defeat. It is not just the end of the battle, it is the end of the plan. Do you agree that for any nomadic army, the greatest danger is the loss of space, the loss of air and direction, where you can deploy your bow and horse? Answer with a simple yes or no and move on to the next facts. Later, we will analyze how discipline and slow pace defeated speed and chaos, and why this day became a symbol of the turning point of an entire era of campaigns. This chapter has no hook, no grand introduction. It is about people and their choices when the noise of battle mixes with the heat of breath, and every second decides who you will remain after. Bohemond maintained his ban on senseless sorties, even though the knights raised on battle knew almost no restraint. Each of them grew up in a culture where honor was measured by the distance traveled alone to the enemy. But on that day, honor meant not rushing forward, but the ability to stand and wait for the signal. Bohemond, sitting on his horse at the entrance to the camp, kept his hand on the hilt of his sword, but did not draw it. His order was cold and precise. No knight was to leave without a sign. And this silence, this refusal to show his usual valor, became the decisive moment. Robert of Normandy and Robert of Flanders held the lines like blacksmiths hold heated metal, not letting it spread until it took the desired shape. Their men were tired, their armor was covered in soot, but they continued to work in groups of 20 or 30, closing the gaps where the shields had fallen. The infantry, led by standard bearers, moved slowly, resisting chaos, and each step was accompanied by the commander's gaze. These small rotations saved the formation. They prevented fatigue from turning into panic. Coordination was more valuable here than bravery. Raymond of Toulouse and Godfrey of Bouillon did not arrive in perfect order. Their journey had been difficult, and their columns had stretched out. But they arrived on time, and that was enough. They did not rush into a scattered attack, but immediately shifted to a restrained pincer movement. Their determination reflected training gained not in nightly tournaments, but in long marches. Their men knew that victory comes not from a single blow, but from an hour of endurance. Thus, the battlefield became a place where the march turned into a coordinated capture rather than a nightly raid. Admar Lepuy, bishop and field chaplain, acted not with a sword, but with his voice. He moved between the ranks, showing not only the banner with the cross, but also calmness. When panic broke out in the crowd, armor fell, spears broke. He raised his hand, and the people saw that the center was alive. His figure stood like an axis around which the field revolved. This man held not the front line, but the belief that everything was still under control. In a difficult moment, discipline was born of trust, not fear. Sultan Kilij Arslan bet on habit. He expected that the Western Knights would not be able to resist the temptation to charge. He knew how they fought. A short rush, then disorder, then flight. And in the first few minutes, everything went exactly as he had planned. But on that day, something changed. The enemy learned right on the battlefield. They began to act not as individual knights, but as one body, one breath, one pulse. When the first wave passed, the Sultan realized that he was facing not a crowd, but an army. He assembled a strong alliance of Anatolian troops, hoping to repeat his recent successes quickly, swiftly, as usual. All he needed to do was sow confusion, make the Western warriors believe that they were surrounded. But instead of panic, he saw steadfastness. Instead of flight, cold discipline. The ambush designed for a short battle dragged on, and its own speed turned against it. That was the peculiarity of the day. It was not the brilliance of weapons or cries of victory, but human endurance that became the decisive factor. Character broke the mold, discipline broke tactics, and inner silence broke the noise of the step battle. This day showed that even techniques proven in dozens of wars lose their power if the enemy stops playing by someone else's rules. Here the score was not only counted in spears and arrows, but also in seconds. When a person chooses not to run, not to shout, not to rush forward, but simply to stand. The terrain around Dorylaeum was unassuming, almost boring to eyes accustomed to epic tales, without high cliffs or fortress walls. But it was precisely in this modesty that its strength lay. The gentle folds of the earth, sparse grass, dusty yellow-gray soil, all this formed a canvas that could only be used by those who knew how to listen to the earth. A narrow river with fords stretched lazily, winding between the lowlands. And in this simplicity lay the ideal frontier for maneuvering. The second column, guided by discipline rather than speed, approached it just when intervention was needed. The crossing went smoothly because the bottom was solid and the current was shallow. A rare gift of fate for an army in the dust. This invisible factor became a salvation, allowing the formation to remain intact when time was already measured in minutes. The dusty ground created a strange ally for both sides. In the morning, it helped the ambush. Sultan Kilij Arslan's troops moved invisibly, their archers disappeared behind the haze, and the first volley struck suddenly. But closer to noon, the same ground worked against them. The dust raised by the horses hung like a heavy cloud, hiding the approach of the allies. When the second column entered the field, the enemy saw it too late. Not as an approaching army, but as a gray shadow on the horizon. The war with the plain turned into a war with the air. Visibility dropped, landmarks disappeared, and the experience of the steppe dwellers lost its significance. The low hills stretching to the southwest gave no advantage to either side. They did not allow long-range archers to deploy in a favorable position, and the enemy's firepower did not turn into the usual wall that crushes infantry lines. The archers shot at random, losing range and density of fire. The defenders, on the other hand, used every feature of the terrain, placing their shields at an angle to turn the uneven ground into cover. They placed their carts and wagons on a flat area, between the hills where the ground was firm and dry. The wheels did not get stuck, and the camp could change shape. Each brick of this improvised wall could be moved, rebuilt, or reinforced. It was not a camp, but a living organism made of wood, iron, and rope. Water became a point of contention not only because of thirst, in this heat, every drop was more valuable than a sword, but also because the river dictated the routes of movement. The narrow banks turned into corridors of maneuver, where cavalry could be hidden or infantry could be brought out under the protection of the bends. The enemy first tried to push the Crusaders away from the water to deprive them not only of drinking water, but also of a foothold for joining their columns. When this failed, they made a second attempt to hold the fords, blocking the Allies' approach. But the defense stood firm, as if rooted to the ground. Spears dug into the clay, shields stuck into the sand, and each wave of attack got bogged down in the same tracks as the previous one. The resistance dragged on, and gradually the geography began to work against those who were in a hurry. The valleys overheated, the horses lost their breath, and the steppe dwellers, accustomed to freedom of maneuver, found themselves trapped between the river, the camp, and the hills. What was supposed to be an open hunting ground turned into a chamber with no exit. For the Crusaders, on the contrary, this field became a shield. They found their rhythm, learned to use its curves, and every minute now worked in their favor. Tactics and terrain came together in one decision, like two halves of a lock. Victory did not come easily. It was a lesson in survival in a terrain where every stream and fold of land could become an ally. This battle proved that it is not always the fastest who wins. It is the one who knows how to wait and listen to the soil breathing under their feet.
Keep the pace. We march until sundown. Men are tired.
The victory at Dorylaeum opened the way eastward for the Crusader army, where beyond the Anatolian plains lay other lands, Cilicia, Antioch, and further on, the coast of Syria and the dream of the Holy City. This was not just an advance, it was a transition from survival to offensive, from defense to campaign. The blow reverberated far beyond the battlefield. Sultan Kilij Arslan, having lost confidence in his invincibility, was forced to redeploy his forces, withdraw garrisons, change routes, and leave fortresses without support. His allies began to waver. Some of the emirates took a wait-and-see approach, while others sought negotiations. The resistance itself did not disappear. It simply went deeper into the terrain and cunning, but the former confidence that the Franks can be worn down by numbers and heat vanished. A blow was dealt to prestige and control in the center of Asia Minor that could not be measured by maps or the number of casualties. The campaign, however, did not become any easier. After Dorylaeum, a difficult march began, during which the old problems of the coalition came to the surface. The knightly troops from different lands had different customs and different ideas about command, and now that the danger had receded, disputes arose again, about primacy, about routes, about supplies. Some demanded to go straight to the coast, others to stick to the northern roads so as not to lose contact with Byzantium. In these discussions, voices of distrust were heard for the first time, which a year later would turn into open accusations. Under the dusty sun of Asia Minor, the lines of future rifts were being drawn, between the Normans and the Southerners, between military and spiritual leaders, between ambition and faith. The oaths made to Constantinople before the campaign became a shadow that followed the army. Emperor Alexius Comnenus expected the Crusader forces to return all the captured lands to Byzantine rule. But for the Western Knights, each step forward increasingly seemed to be their own achievement, bought with blood. This gap in perception was not immediately apparent, but it could be felt in the looks, in the dry negotiations, in the weary reports. Imperial escorts led the columns along mountain roads. Supplies came from Byzantine warehouses. But behind every cart that passed, tension could be felt. Western commanders increasingly viewed Byzantium not as an ally, but as an observer ready to reap the fruits of their labor. When the dust had not yet settled at Dorylaeum, field councils were already discussing which of the leaders had the right to be called commander-in-chief. Bohemond, Godfrey, Raymond, and Robert, each of them saw victory as a step toward their own legend, not toward shared glory. Byzantium, for its part, expected accountability and discipline, not understanding that for people who had come from feudal Europe, the very idea of submitting to a single emperor sounded like a deprivation of honor. As they moved southeast, the roads became more difficult, the heat more intense, and trust weaker. At first, minor misunderstandings were attributed to fatigue, but gradually they turned into mutual recriminations. When the troops approached Antioch a few months later, this accumulated resentment exploded into accusations. The emperor had not come, had not helped, had not kept his promises, and then, at Dorylaeum, it seemed like a trifle. Empty words against the backdrop of victory. Dorylaeum turned out to be not just a military milestone, but a moment when victory divided the allies. It was here that the idea arose that success does not necessarily belong to everyone equally. The victory on the plains showed that the West could stand on its own, without Byzantine support, and this idea proved to be far more dangerous than any defeat. Amidst the noise of encouragement and the crack of bowstrings, the distant rumblings of a future conflict could already be heard, a conflict that would later destroy the bridge between Constantinople and the Latin world. Thus, the day of glory became the day of the first mistrust. Thus, a military victory gave rise to a political divide that determined the fate of the entire First Crusade. And so, looking back, we can say that the road to the east opened up right here, but along with it, a rift opened up that would one day reach the sea itself. This battle was the first major proof that the Crusader alliance could withstand an open-field battle without walls or fortresses. It showed how a defense made of wagons and shields could survive a barrage of arrows and then turn into an organized counterattack. It taught commanders not to confuse knightly honor with senseless pursuit and marching with the dispersion of forces, and it proved that even perfect nomadic tactics have an Achilles heel: time on the battlefield, which can be bought with discipline and order. From that day on, the road to the east became more real, and the troops' own confidence stronger. But along with confidence, claims also grew, and this is where another story begins. Coalitions rarely withstand long trials without disputes over cities, trophies, and oaths. Victory gives the right to demand, and demands give rise to cracks. This lesson would become particularly clear at the walls of Antioch, where the word betrayal would enter the annals of history. And yet, the foundation was laid here, at the dusty ford, where faith and order outweighed speed and arrows.
Their victory was won not by speed, but by their control over time. An invaluable lesson for future
What do you
battles.
think of this topic and this look at the first major battle of the campaign, where the camp became a fortress and the march became a hammer that closed the pincers? Write if you agree that the main weapon of that day was not the spear, but patience and time management, and suggest topics for future videos about decisive battles of the past. Also, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our new analyses.